Tonight, you'll probably sleep in a bed that doesn't move. You'll wake up on solid ground, drink clean water from a tap, and never once wonder if the person next to you is about to die of scurvy. But for most of human history, that was the deal you made the moment you stepped onto a ship. You gave up the ground, you gave up fresh food, you gave up your say in almost everything, and in exchange, you got the ocean. The real answer to what life at sea was actually like is far stranger than pirate movies let on. It wasn't swashbuckling. It was closer to slow, grinding survival, packed into a wooden box with 300 strangers, floating on top of a void that could kill you in 100 different ways before lunch. Let's start with the smell. Ships didn't smell like salt air and adventure. They smelled like a barn that had been sealed shut for 6 months. Below deck, men slept in hammocks stacked so close together that when one person rolled over, he touched the next man's back. There was no plumbing. Waste went into a bucket or straight over the side if you were lucky enough to be on deck. Bilge water, the filthy water that collected at the bottom of the hull, sat there for weeks, growing thicker and more toxic. Sailors called it the ship's breath, and new recruits often vomited the moment they climbed below for the first time. Historian N.A.M. Roger, who spent decades studying the Royal Navy, described the lower decks of an 18th century warship as some of the most densely packed, disease-ridden environments a human being could occupy without being in a prison. And in a sense, it was a prison. Most sailors didn't choose this life. Press gangs roamed British port towns, grabbing men off the street and forcing them into naval service. You could be a fisherman, a farmhand, or a drunk stumbling home from a tavern, and by morning you belonged to the King's Navy. Once you were aboard, desertion meant death. Mutiny meant death. Even falling asleep on watch could mean death. The ship became your entire world, and the rules of that world were absolute. So what did people actually eat out there? This is where the myth of the ocean voyage falls apart fastest. Food started decent enough in port, but within weeks it began to rot. Biscuits, the twice-baked bread meant to survive months at sea, became infested with weevils, small beetles that burrowed into the flour. Sailors developed a habit of tapping their biscuit on the table before eating it, just to knock the weevils loose. Some didn't bother. They ate in the dark, on purpose, so they wouldn't have to watch what they were swallowing. Meat was preserved in barrels of brine, salted so heavily it had to be soaked in seawater for hours just to become edible, and even then it often came out gray, stringy, and barely recognizable as food. Sailors joked that the beef was so old it had crossed the ocean more times than the crew. Butter turned rancid. Water stored in wooden casks grew a film of algae and had to be strained through cloth before drinking, and even then it tasted like the inside of the barrel. Beer was often safer than water because the brewing process killed bacteria that untreated water couldn't. This is part of why sailors were given a daily ration of rum or beer. It wasn't a party, it was in some strange way a public health measure, but nothing defined the horror of long voyages quite like scurvy. You've heard of it. What you probably haven't heard is how brutal it actually was. Scurvy comes from a lack of vitamin C, something the body needs to keep connective tissue and blood vessels intact. Without it, old wounds reopen, teeth loosen and fall out. Gums turn black and swell over the teeth like rotting fruit. Sailors described a strange, bone-deep exhaustion, as if their bodies had simply decided to stop working. On long voyages, scurvy could kill more men than combat, storms, and shipwrecks combined. It took an unbearably long time for anyone to figure out why. In 1747, a Scottish naval surgeon named James Lind ran what's now considered one of the first controlled clinical trials in history. He took 12 sailors, all suffering from scurvy, split them into pairs, and gave each pair a different treatment: cider, vinegar, seawater, a spiced paste, or citrus fruit. The pair given oranges and lemons recovered almost immediately. Lind had found the answer, and then, almost unbelievably, the British Navy ignored him for nearly 50 years before finally making citrus rations standard practice. 50 years of sailors dying from a problem that had already been solved. Why? Reframe that question for a second, because it says something bigger about how humans behave, not just at sea, but everywhere. Institutions are slow. Bureaucracies protect old habits even when new evidence is sitting right in front of them. The ocean didn't kill those sailors. Human stubbornness did. Now picture the storms. A modern cruise ship barely rocks in rough water. An 18th century sailing ship was a different story entirely. Waves could rise higher than the mast. Wind could snap wood like a twig. Sailors climbed rigging 100 feet above a deck that was pitching violently in every direction, in the dark, in freezing rain, with nothing but a rope and their own grip standing between them and the sea. Falls were common. Survival often wasn't. And even when the weather cooperated, the isolation itself became its own kind of danger. Voyages could last 6 months, a year, sometimes longer. There was no way to call home. No way to know if a war had started, if a family member had died, if the world you left behind still resembled the one you'd returned to. Psychologists who study extreme isolation today, including researchers studying Antarctic expedition crews, have found that long-term confinement with the same small group of people produces a very specific kind of psychological strain. Sharpened irritability, shifting alliances, and an intense need for ritual and routine just to hold the mind together. Sailors in the Age of Sail lived that experience for months at a time, without a support team monitoring their well-being, without therapy, without any way out. So they built rituals. Crossing the equator became an elaborate ceremony where first-time sailors were initiated by more experienced crew in strange costumed rituals involving King Neptune, seawater dunkings, and mock trials. It sounds absurd today, but it served a real purpose. It gave men something to look forward to, a shared story, a sense of belonging inside a system that otherwise offered them almost nothing. Music served a similar function. Sea shanties weren't just songs, they were tools. Sailors used the rhythm of a shanty to synchronize the exhausting, repetitive labor of hauling ropes and raising anchors. A caller would sing a line and the crew would answer in unison, timing their pull to the beat. It turned brutal physical work into something almost bearable, a shared heartbeat that made 300 exhausted men move as one. Here's the twist that most people miss entirely. For all its horror, life at sea also offered something that land-based life, especially in the 18th century, almost never did. Mobility. A poor farm boy with no prospects could join a ship's crew and, through skill and survival, rise to become an officer. Rank on a ship was rarely inherited the way land and title were. It was earned through competence, endurance, and, frankly, luck. Historian Marcus Rediker, who studies maritime labor history, has argued that ships were some of the most diverse and unexpectedly meritocratic workplaces of their era, with sailors from different nations, races, and backgrounds working, eating, and surviving side by side in a way that rarely happened on land. That doesn't mean it was fair, it wasn't. Discipline was brutal, punishments were public, and floggings were common enough that sailors developed dark humor around them, joking about kissing the gunner's daughter, a phrase for being tied to a cannon and whipped. But within that brutal hierarchy, there was a strange kind of equality, too. The storm didn't care about your birth. Neither did scurvy, neither did the sea. So why does any of this matter now when your biggest daily risk is a spilled coffee in a slow elevator? Because the ocean stripped away everything except the essentials of human survival, and what's left underneath tells you something true about people in general. Humans build ritual out of nothing. Humans find rhythm in shared suffering. Humans form intense bonds with the small group of people they're stuck with, whether that group is a ship's crew or a modern office team or a college dorm floor. The setting has changed, the wiring hasn't. Tonight, you'll sleep in a bed that doesn't move, in air that doesn't smell like bilge water, with food that won't rot before you finish the bag. But somewhere in you is the same brain that once needed a shanty to survive the workday, the same brain that turns hardship into ritual just to make it bearable. You're not so far from that hammock after all.